Jonathan Roumie's eyes fluttered open on the cold concrete floor backstage at the Chicago theater, surrounded by concerned faces and the distant echo of thousands of fans still chanting his name. His first whispered words stunned everyone in the room. I saw his face. Jesus was right there with me. What happened in those crucial moments of unconsciousness would change everything about how the beloved actor understood his faith and his calling. Jonathan, Jonathan, can you hear me? The voice belonged to Maria Santos, the tour manager who had been frantically trying to revive him for the past 3 minutes. Roumie blinked slowly, his vision still hazy as he tried to focus on the circle of worried faces above him. The metallic taste in his mouth and the throbbing in his temples reminded him that something had gone terribly wrong during what should have been a routine evening. Don't try to sit up yet, urged Dr. Patricia Coleman, the venue's on-call physician, who had rushed backstage the moment security called for medical assistance. She knelt beside Roumie, checking his pulse and examining his pupils with a small flashlight. The actor's breathing was steady now, but his color remained pale, and she could see the exhaustion etched deeply in the lines around his eyes that makeup had failed to conceal. Roumie's mind began to clear as he remembered where he was, the final stop of his grueling 3-month speaking tour that had taken him to 47 cities across North America. The audience, he whispered, his voice hoarse and barely audible. They're waiting for me. I have to. He attempted to push himself up from the floor, but his arms trembled with the effort, betraying just how depleted his body had become. The audience is fine, Maria assured him gently, placing a steadying hand on his shoulder. We told them you needed a brief intermission. They're praying for you out there. You should hear them. But Jonathan, you collapsed right before your entrance. One moment you were standing in the wings, and the next... She paused, unable to finish the sentence, as the memory of seeing him crumple to the ground replayed in her mind. The backstage area of the historic Chicago theater buzzed with quiet activity, as crew members whispered among themselves, some making phone calls to cancel the remainder of the evening's program. Roumie could hear fragments of their conversations. Completely exhausted. Hasn't been sleeping. Pushing himself too hard. Each word felt like a weight on his chest, confirming what he had been trying to ignore for weeks. His body was failing him. 3 months earlier, Roumie had embarked on this ambitious tour with the enthusiasm and energy that had made him famous for his portrayal of Jesus in The Chosen. The idea had been simple: travel across the country, sharing his faith journey and connecting with fans who had been touched by the show. What he hadn't anticipated was how emotionally and physically demanding it would be to pour his heart out night after night, in city after city. I need to tell you all something, Roumie said softly, his voice gaining strength as he managed to prop himself up on his elbows. The small group gathered around him. Maria, Dr. Coleman, his assistant David, and 2 security guards leaned in closer. When I was unconscious, I wasn't alone. I know this might sound strange, but I saw Jesus. Not a vision or a dream, but him. His face was so clear, so peaceful. Dr. Coleman exchanged a glance with Maria, both women trying to hide their concern. Post-fainting experiences could sometimes include hallucinations or disorientation, but Roumie's voice carried a conviction that went beyond medical explanation. Jonathan, the doctor said carefully, sometimes when we lose consciousness, our brain can create vivid experiences. It's completely normal after what you've been through. No, you don't understand, Roumie insisted, his eyes brightening with an intensity that seemed to contradict his physical weakness. This wasn't my brain creating anything. He spoke to me. Jesus told me that I've been carrying burdens that were never meant to be mine alone. He said. Roumie paused, his voice catching with emotion. He said he's been waiting for me to remember that even he rested. David, who had been Roumie's assistant for 2 years, stepped forward with a bottle of water and a concerned expression. "Jonathan, you haven't slept more than 4 hours a night in weeks. Between the performances, the meet and greets, the interviews, and the travel, you've been running on adrenaline and coffee. I tried to tell you to slow down, but you kept saying people were counting on you." The mention of his relentless schedule brought back a flood of memories from the past months. City after city, theater after theater. Thousands of faces looking at him with hope and expectation. Roumie remembered the single mother in Detroit who had driven 6 hours to hear him speak about faith and purpose. He thought of the teenage boy in Phoenix who had struggled with depression and found hope through The Chosen. "They were counting on me," Roumie said quietly, accepting the water bottle with shaking hands. "Every night I would see their faces in the audience, people who had traveled hundreds of miles, spent their hard-earned money, just to hear something that might help them through whatever they're facing. How could I disappoint them? How could I tell them I was too tired to share God's love?" Maria sat down on a nearby equipment case, her expression softening with understanding. She had worked with many performers over her 15-year career, but she had never seen someone push themselves the way Roumie had during this tour. "Jonathan, do you remember what you told that reporter in Nashville 3 weeks ago? About how portraying Jesus had taught you about the importance of self-care and setting boundaries?" Roumie nodded slowly, a rueful smile crossing his face. "I remember. I talked about how Jesus withdrew to pray and rest, how he modeled healthy rhythms for his disciples. I spoke about the danger of believing we have to save everyone ourselves." He paused, the irony of his own words hitting him fully. "And then I went right back to my hotel room and worked until 3 in the morning on my next speech. If you've ever struggled with pushing yourself beyond God's intended limits, comment the words 'I believe' below, because believing in His grace means accepting that rest isn't rebellion." Dr. Coleman finished checking Roumie's blood pressure and looked up with concern. "Your vital signs are stabilizing, but they're telling a story of severe exhaustion. When did you last have a full meal that wasn't grabbed between events? When did you last have a day off where you actually rested instead of working?" The questions hung in the air as Roumie struggled to remember the last time he had truly taken care of himself. The sound of the audience beyond the curtain had shifted from excited chatter to something that sounded more like a prayer meeting. Maria pulled out her phone and showed Roumie a live stream that someone in the audience was broadcasting. Hundreds of people were holding hands, their voices joined in worship songs and prayers for his recovery. "They love you, Jonathan, but not because you're perfect or invincible. They love you because you're human." Watching the live stream, Roumie felt a wave of emotion wash over him. These weren't fans demanding a performance. They were a community of believers genuinely concerned for his well-being. "I've been so focused on giving them what I thought they needed," he whispered, "that I forgot they might just need to see someone who understands struggle, someone who knows what it means to be human and broken and still loved by God." David knelt down beside his employer and friend, his voice gentle but firm. "Jonathan, I've watched you transform lives these past 3 months. I've seen people leave your events with hope they didn't have when they arrived, but I've also watched you disappear a little more each night. The man who plays Jesus so beautifully has forgotten that Jesus himself was kind to his own human limitations." "The strangest part about seeing his face," Roumie continued, his voice stronger now as he sat up fully with Maria's help, "was that he wasn't disappointed in me for being exhausted. He wasn't angry that I had collapsed. If anything, he looked relieved. Like he had been waiting for me to finally admit that I couldn't do everything alone." The revelation seemed to surprise Roumie himself as he spoke the words. Dr. Coleman finished packing her medical bag and turned to face the group. "From a medical standpoint, Jonathan needs immediate rest. Not just a few hours of sleep, but days of actual recovery. His body has been running on stress hormones for months, and if he doesn't take time to heal properly, this could happen again, possibly with more serious consequences. Her words carried the weight of professional authority mixed with genuine concern. The backstage area fell quiet except for the distant sound of the audience, still gathered in prayer and song. Roumie closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them, there was a different quality to his gaze, less frantic, more peaceful. "I think I've been afraid," he admitted quietly. "Afraid that if I slowed down, if I said no to opportunities, I would somehow be failing God, or failing the people who believe in this show." Maria leaned forward, her voice carrying years of experience managing artists who had struggled with similar pressures. "Jonathan, can I tell you what I've learned in 15 years of working with performers? The ones who last, who make a real difference over time, are the ones who learn to pace themselves. They understand that sustainability isn't selfish. It's necessary for long-term impact." Roumie thought about the early days of filming The Chosen, when director Dallas Jenkins had insisted on creating a set environment that honored both the sacred nature of the story and the human needs of the cast and crew. There had been regular breaks, time for reflection and prayer, and an understanding that doing God's work didn't mean ignoring the bodies and minds God had given them to steward. "I remember filming the Sermon on the Mount scene," Roumie said, a smile beginning to break through his exhaustion. "Dallas called for a break after my first take, even though it went well because he could see I was emotionally drained. He said, 'Jesus preached with authority because he was connected to the Father, not because he was running on empty.' I thought I understood that then." David pulled out his phone and showed Roumie the schedule for the remaining tour dates. "We have 12 more cities scheduled over the next month. But Jonathan, we could postpone them. The venues would understand, and the audiences would rather wait than see you hurt yourself trying to meet unrealistic expectations." The prospect of disappointing so many people still made Roumie's chest tighten with anxiety. "What if we restructured things completely?" Maria suggested, her mind already working through alternatives. "Instead of these marathon solo events, what if we created smaller, more intimate gatherings? You could still share your message, but in a way that allows for real rest and recovery between events. Quality over quantity." The idea sparked something in Roumie's tired eyes, a possibility he hadn't considered. Dr. Coleman, who had been listening to the conversation while monitoring Roumie's condition, spoke up. "The human body isn't designed for the kind of schedule you've been maintaining. Even the most dedicated athletes build in recovery time. Your faith journey isn't a sprint, Jonathan. It's a marathon that requires wisdom about pacing and endurance." Her words resonated with something Roumie remembered from his spiritual director's teachings. "Father Michael always told me that God's work includes Sabbath rest," Roumie reflected, thinking of his longtime spiritual mentor back in Los Angeles. "He said that the enemy's greatest victory isn't making us sinful. It's making us so busy doing good things that we forget to abide in the source of all goodness." I think I've been running from that truth for months. The sound from the audience had evolved into something beautiful and unexpected. Instead of growing restless or demanding refunds, the crowd had spontaneously organized into small prayer circles throughout the theater. Social media posts from the event showed people sharing stories of their own struggles with exhaustion and burnout, creating an impromptu support network born from concern for Roumie's well-being. Maria showed Roumie some of the posts on her phone. "Look at this, Jonathan." A nurse from the ICU talking about how she's been working double shifts for months and had forgotten to care for herself. A pastor admitting he's been preaching about rest while never taking any. Your vulnerability tonight is ministering to people in ways your planned speech never could have. Roumie stared at the phone screen, reading story after story of people who were recognizing their own exhaustion in his collapse. This is what he meant, he whispered, his voice filled with wonder. When Jesus told me I was carrying burdens that weren't mine alone, he wasn't just talking about my personal struggles. He was talking about this idea that I have to be the perfect example, the one who never fails or falters. David, who had grown up in a ministry family and understood the unique pressures Roumie faced, nodded knowingly. My dad always said the most powerful sermons are preached not from our strengths, but from our honest acknowledgement of our need for grace. Maybe tonight isn't a failure, Jonathan. Maybe it's exactly the message people needed to hear. That even those who portrayed Jesus struggle with human limitations. Dr. Coleman checked her watch and made a decision. I'm going to recommend that we have you transported to the hospital for a more thorough evaluation. Not because I think something is seriously wrong, but because your body has been through trauma, and we need to make sure everything is functioning properly. It's a precaution, but an important one. Her professional tone left no room for argument. Before we do anything else, Roumie said, struggling to his feet with Maria and David's help, I need to speak to the audience, not to perform or give a prepared speech, but to share what happened here tonight. They deserve honesty, and maybe my honesty is exactly what they need to hear. His legs were still shaky, but his voice carried a new kind of strength. Maria looked uncertain. Jonathan, are you sure you're up for that? Dr. Coleman just recommended the hospital, and you can barely stand without assistance. The audience will understand if you need to leave quietly. But even as she spoke the words, she could see the determination in Roumie's eyes. Not the frantic drive that had characterized recent weeks, but something deeper and more sustainable. I've been performing for months, Roumie said quietly. Tonight I want to just be human with them, to tell them what Jesus showed me on this floor, in this moment of complete vulnerability. If I can't share weakness and still point to God's strength, then what have I really learned about the gospel? His words carried a conviction that seemed to surprise even him. Dr. Coleman considered his request carefully. If you're determined to do this, we'll need to keep it very brief. 5 minutes maximum. You'll sit while you speak, and we'll have a wheelchair standing by. The moment you feel dizzy or weak, we stop immediately. Her conditions were non-negotiable, but she seemed to understand the spiritual importance of what Roumie was asking to do. David and Maria worked quickly to communicate with the theater management and the audience. A simple announcement was made. Jonathan would speak briefly, but the evening's format would be different than planned. The response from the crowd was immediate and supportive applause, mixed with audible prayers and expressions of relief that he was conscious and able to speak. As they prepared a chair on stage and adjusted the lighting to be gentler on Roumie's sensitive eyes, he found himself thinking about all the times Jesus had shown weakness and vulnerability in the Gospels. He wept at Lazarus's tomb, Roumie murmured to himself. He fell asleep in the boat during the storm. He asked for help carrying his cross. Why did I think I had to be stronger than he was? The curtain rose slowly, revealing not the polished speaker the audience had expected, but a man sitting simply in a chair, his hair disheveled, his face pale but peaceful. The theater fell into complete silence as Roumie reached for the microphone with slightly trembling hands. Thank you for praying, he began, his voice soft but clear in the acoustically perfect space. I need to tell you what just happened backstage, Roumie continued, his words carrying an intimacy that no prepared speech could have achieved. About 20 minutes ago, I collapsed from exhaustion. My body finally said what my mind had been refusing to acknowledge for months, that I'm human, and humans have limits. But something beautiful happened while I was unconscious. The audience listened with rapt attention as Roumie described his experience of seeing Jesus' face during those moments of unconsciousness. He spoke without notes, without his usual polished delivery, but with a raw honesty that seemed to electrify the air in the theater. He wasn't disappointed in my weakness, Roumie shared. He was compassionate toward it, the way he always is. A woman in the third row wiped tears from her eyes as Roumie continued. For months, I've been trying to be worthy of playing Jesus by being perfect, by never showing weakness or need. But tonight, he reminded me that his strength is made perfect in our weakness. Not despite our weakness, through it, in it, because of it. His words seemed to unlock something in the hearts of everyone listening. I don't know what your struggles are tonight, Roumie said, his voice growing stronger even as he remained seated. But I know that if you're here, you're probably carrying something heavy. Maybe it's expectations, your own or others. Maybe it's the feeling that you have to be strong for everyone else. Maybe it's the fear that if you show weakness, you'll somehow dishonor God. The theater had become a sacred space, with people throughout the audience nodding in recognition and understanding. A pastor in the balcony found himself thinking about his own sleepless nights and impossible schedule. A mother near the stage recognized her own struggle to be everything to everyone while neglecting her own needs. Roumie's vulnerability was creating permission for their own. Here's what I learned on that backstage floor, Roumie continued, leaning forward slightly in his chair. Jesus isn't asking us to be superhuman. He's asking us to be honestly human, to acknowledge our need for him, for rest, for community, for grace. The most Christ-like thing I could do tonight wasn't to push through and perform. It was to admit I needed help. David watched from the wings as the audience received these words with something that went beyond applause, a collective exhale of relief and recognition. Social media posts from the theater were already spreading, with people sharing their own struggles with perfectionism and exhaustion. What had begun as a speaking event was transforming into a moment of corporate healing and honesty. I want to ask you to do something with me, Roumie said, his voice taking on a tone of gentle invitation. I want you to think about one burden you've been carrying that was never meant to be yours alone. One expectation you've placed on yourself that's heavier than love. One way you've been trying to earn what's already been freely given. The silence in the theater was profound and sacred. As he sat in that chair, looking out at hundreds of faces, softly illuminated by the stage lights, Roumie felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Peace. Not the frantic energy that had driven him from city to city, but the deep peace that comes from alignment with truth. We're going to pray together, he said simply, not as a performance, but as a family, acknowledging our shared need for grace. What happened next wasn't planned or choreographed. As Roumie began to pray, his words simple and heartfelt, people throughout the theater began to respond. Some wept quietly, others raised their hands. Many reached out to touch the shoulders of strangers beside them. The prayer became a conversation between heaven and earth, mediated by shared vulnerability and mutual recognition of human frailty. Lord, Roumie prayed, his voice carrying clearly through the theater's sound system. Thank you for loving us enough to let us fall down sometimes. Thank you for being strong enough to carry what we cannot. Help us remember that our worth isn't measured by our productivity or our perfection, but by your unchanging love for us. The simplicity of his words made them all the more powerful. In the balcony, an elderly man who had driven 4 hours to attend the event found himself crying for the first time in years. He had come expecting to hear about faith, and found himself experiencing it instead. Near the stage, a college student struggling with anxiety felt her breathing slow for the first time in weeks. Roumie's breakdown was becoming everyone's breakthrough. Dr. Coleman, watching from the wings with her medical bag at the ready, found herself moved despite her professional detachment. She had seen many cases of exhaustion and burnout, but she had never witnessed someone transform their moment of physical collapse into an opportunity for spiritual healing, both their own and others. Roumie's color was returning, and his breathing had stabilized completely. As the prayer continued, Roumie felt a strength returning to his body that had nothing to do with adrenaline or willpower. This was the strength that comes from surrender, from acknowledging limitation, and finding grace sufficient for every weakness. "I don't know how long this tour will take now," he said, opening his eyes to look at the audience. "But I know it will look different than what we planned." Maria, watching from backstage, was already mentally restructuring the remaining tour dates. Instead of the breakneck pace they had maintained, she envisioned smaller venues, longer stays in each city, time for Roumie to rest, and for audiences to process what they had experienced. The logistics would be challenging, but the authenticity of this moment had shown her what truly mattered. "Some of you traveled far to be here tonight," Roumie acknowledged, his voice carrying both gratitude and gentle concern. "You may have expected a different kind of evening, but I believe God orchestrated this exactly as it needed to happen. Sometimes, His greatest gifts come wrapped in our deepest struggles. Sometimes, our most powerful testimonies emerge from our moments of complete dependence on His grace." A teenager near the front row held up his phone, and Roumie could see that he was live streaming the event. Instead of feeling pressure to perform, Roumie felt peace, knowing that this message of vulnerability and grace was reaching beyond the walls of the theater. "If you're watching online," he said, speaking directly to the camera, "you're part of this family too. Your struggles matter, your weariness is seen, and your need for grace is met." The impromptu nature of what was happening had created something that couldn't be manufactured or produced. Authentic community born from shared struggle and mutual recognition of divine love. People were exchanging contact information, promising to pray for one another, making connections that would last long after the theater lights dimmed. Roumie's collapse had become a catalyst for deep, lasting fellowship. "I want to share one more thing Jesus showed me," Roumie said, his voice strong now despite his physical exhaustion. "He reminded me that his disciples were not perfect performers. They fell asleep when he needed them most. They doubted even after seeing miracles. They argued about who was greatest while he prepared for the cross. But he loved them not despite their weaknesses, but through them. And he used their imperfections to build his church." David, watching from the wings, was amazed at the transformation he was witnessing. The man who had collapsed from exhaustion just an hour ago was now radiating a peace and authority that had nothing to do with physical strength. This wasn't the manic energy that had characterized recent performances. This was the steady, sustainable power that comes from abiding rather than striving. As Roumie spoke about the disciples' imperfections, a pastor in the audience found himself thinking about his own struggles with pride and the pressure to have all the answers. A missionary on furlough recognized her own battle with feeling that rest meant weakness. A seminary student understood for the first time that academic knowledge and spiritual maturity weren't the same thing. The permission to be human was revolutionary. "If you're a parent who feels like you're failing your children," Roumie continued, his words becoming more specific and personal. "If you're a pastor who struggles with doubt, if you're a student overwhelmed by expectations, if you're anyone who has ever felt that your weakness disqualifies you from God's love, tonight is for you. Your Father sees your effort, He honors your heart, and He loves you exactly as you are." The theater had become a sanctuary, with the kind of holy silence that descends when eternal truth intersects with temporal need. People were not just hearing these words, they were receiving them as personal messages from a God who saw their specific struggles and loved them through them. Roumie's physical weakness had become a conduit for spiritual strength that filled every corner of the ancient theater. Dr. Coleman checked her watch, and caught Roumie's eye from the wings, reminding him of their agreement about keeping his appearance brief. But as she watched the healing happening in that theater, not just for Roumie but for hundreds of others, she understood that some moments transcend medical protocols. This was pastoral care on a scale she had never witnessed, born from authentic vulnerability. "I need to go to the hospital now," Roumie said simply, acknowledging both his physical needs and the doctor's concerned presence in the wings. "My body needs rest and care, and that's not something to be ashamed of. But before I go, I want to invite you into something beautiful. Don't let this moment end when you leave this theater. Carry this permission to be human with you." The audience began to applaud, but it wasn't the polite applause of a typical speaking event. This was the kind of applause that comes from deep gratitude, from hearts that have been touched, and spirits that have been freed. Many people were crying openly, not from sadness but from relief. The relief of being known and loved in their weakness, not just their strength. As Maria and David prepared to help Roumie from the stage, he paused for one final thought. "The most beautiful part of playing Jesus," he said, his voice carrying clearly without amplification, "isn't portraying his power or his wisdom. It's portraying his humanity, his compassion for our struggles, his understanding of our limitations, his love that meets us exactly where we are. That's the Jesus I met backstage tonight. And that's the Jesus who meets you wherever you are right now." As Roumie stood carefully from his chair, supported by David and Maria, something unprecedented happened in the theater. Instead of rushing toward the stage for autographs or photos, the audience began to form prayer circles throughout the venue. What had started as his moment of weakness was transforming into a corporate experience of divine strength, community, and authentic fellowship that no one had planned, but everyone needed. "This is what revival looks like," whispered Dr. Coleman to a stage hand, as she watched hundreds of people embracing, praying, and sharing their own stories of struggle and hope. She had expected to treat a medical emergency, and instead found herself witnessing a spiritual awakening, born from one man's honest acknowledgement of his human limitations and God's sufficient grace. The live stream from the event was being shared thousands of times across social media platforms, but not as entertainment or viral content. People were sharing it as testimony, as encouragement, as proof that authentic vulnerability could create sacred space, even in a digital age. Comments poured in from viewers around the world who recognized their own exhaustion and found hope in Roumie's story. As they slowly made their way toward the stage exit, Roumie stopped and turned back to the audience one final time. The sight that met his eyes would remain etched in his memory forever. Not a crowd of consumers waiting to be entertained, but a family of believers ministering to one another, sharing burdens, and creating the kind of community that could only emerge from shared acknowledgement of weakness and grace. "Do you see what you've done?" Maria whispered to Roumie as they paused at the edge of the stage. "You collapsed from exhaustion and somehow created the most powerful ministry moment I've ever witnessed. God really can use all things for good, can't he?" Her voice carried wonder and something approaching awe as she watched the continued fellowship unfolding throughout the theater. Roumie nodded, tears streaming down his face as he watched strangers become friends, as people shared phone numbers and promised to continue praying for one another. As the rigid structure of a typical speaking event dissolved into something organic and beautiful. "This is what he showed me," Roumie said softly, "that my weakness isn't a barrier to his work. It's often the doorway through which his strength enters the world." The elderly man from the balcony had made his way down to the main floor and was now praying with the anxious college student, their age difference irrelevant in the face of shared humanity and mutual need for grace. The pastor was being ministered to by a nurse who understood the weight of caring for others while neglecting oneself. Everywhere Roumie looked, he saw the kingdom of God made manifest through honest community. Dr. Coleman approached the stage with a wheelchair, her medical training reasserting itself despite the spiritual atmosphere surrounding them. "Jonathan, this has been beautiful, but we really do need to get you checked out. Your body has been through trauma, and we need to make sure everything is functioning properly." Her voice was gentle but firm, reminding everyone that spiritual truth didn't negate physical reality. As Roumie settled into the wheelchair, he felt something he hadn't experienced in months: complete peace with his limitations. The fear that had driven him to exhaustion, the fear of disappointing people, of being seen as weak, of failing in his calling, had been replaced by an understanding that God's love wasn't contingent on his performance, but was most powerfully displayed through his vulnerability. The theater management had expected to close the venue and dismiss the audience hours ago, but instead they found themselves witnessing something they had never seen in decades of hosting events. People were reluctant to leave, not because they were waiting for more entertainment, but because they had discovered something rare and precious: a community where weakness was welcomed and grace was tangible. As they began to wheel Roumie toward the backstage exit, the audience became aware that he was leaving. Instead of calling out for his attention or demanding final words, they began to sing, not a planned song, but a spontaneous worship that arose from hearts that had been touched and spirits that had been freed. The sound followed Roumie as he disappeared into the wings, a benediction of love and gratitude. In the hospital room 3 hours later, Roumie lay connected to an IV that was slowly rehydrating his depleted system, while Dr. Patterson, the emergency physician, reviewed his test results. Severe dehydration, exhaustion, and what we call adrenal fatigue, she explained to Maria and David, who had refused to leave his side. His body simply shut down from months of operating beyond its capacity. He needs complete rest for at least a week, then a gradual return to activity. "The strangest thing," Roumie said to his companions as the IV fluids began to restore his energy, "is that I feel more rested now than I have in months, even though I'm lying in a hospital bed. It's like finally surrendering to my limitations actually gave me the peace I was trying to find through productivity." His color had returned, and his eyes held a clarity that had been missing for weeks. Maria showed him her phone, which had been buzzing constantly with messages from venues, media outlets, and individuals who had heard about the night's events. "Everyone wants to know when you'll be back on tour," she said. "But more importantly, people are sharing their own stories of burnout and breakthrough. You've given people permission to be human, Jonathan. That's a gift that will keep giving long after you've recovered." David had been fielding calls from the remaining tour venues, and the response had been overwhelmingly supportive. "Every single venue has agreed to postpone," he reported. "Several offered to hold the dates indefinitely until you're fully recovered. But more than that, some are asking if we could restructure the events to be more like what happened tonight: smaller, more intimate, with time for real fellowship and prayer." The possibility excited rather than overwhelmed Roumie. As the night deepened toward morning, Roumie found himself reflecting on Jesus' words from his unconscious vision: "Even I rested." The Son of God, who could have healed the sick and taught the crowds 24 hours a day, had instead modeled rhythms of work and rest, engagement and withdrawal, ministry and solitude. "I think I finally understand why he went away to pray," Roumie murmured as sleep began to claim him. 6 months later, Jonathan Roumie stood on the stage of a small community center in Topeka, Kansas, before an audience of just 200 people. The new format of his speaking tour allowed for 3 days in each location: 1 day of rest and preparation, 1 day of speaking and fellowship, and one day of personal meetings and prayer with individuals who needed deeper ministry. The pace was sustainable, the impact was deeper, and Roumie's health had been completely restored. "I want to tell you about the night I learned that God's strength really is made perfect in weakness," he began, sharing the story that had become central to his ministry. The narrative of his collapse and spiritual awakening in Chicago had been told in dozens of cities, but it never lost its power because it remained grounded in truth and vulnerability, rather than performance and perfection. The ripple effects of that night continued to spread far beyond the tour itself. Churches across the country had begun hosting vulnerability nights, where people could share their struggles without judgment. Pastors were incorporating Sabbath rhythms into their schedules and teaching their congregations about the spiritual discipline of rest. The entertainment industry was beginning conversations about sustainable schedules and mental health support for performers. In his hotel room that night, Roumie opened his journal and wrote, "6 months ago, I thought collapse meant failure. Tonight I understand that it was actually breakthrough, not just for me, but for everyone who witnessed God's grace, meeting human weakness with love instead of judgment. The most Christ-like thing I ever did was admit I couldn't do everything myself." His handwriting was steady, his spirit peaceful. As he prepared for sleep, Roumie thought about the faces in the audience that evening, people who had driven hours to hear not a polished performance, but an honest testimony of struggle and grace. He remembered the young mother who had approached him afterward, tears in her eyes, saying, "Thank you for showing me that even Jesus' followers can be tired and still be loved." Her words echoed the transformation that had begun on a backstage floor in Chicago. The actor who had once feared that showing weakness would diminish his witness now understood that vulnerability had become his greatest ministry tool. As he drifted off to sleep, Roumie whispered a prayer of gratitude for the God who had met him in his moment of complete collapse and transformed it into a testimony of perfect love. What began as his lowest moment had become his greatest revelation, that in our weakness, His strength is not just revealed, it is made perfect. If this story touched your heart or reminded you of God's grace in your own struggles, please subscribe for more inspiring testimonies and comment below to share how you've experienced His strength in your moments of weakness.